May 10, 1945. Rosenheim, Bavaria. The American trucks came at dawn, their olive-green canvas sides still wet with morning fog. Gerda Mannheim stood at her kitchen window, the one with the crack running diagonally across the glass like a frozen lightning bolt, and felt her hands begin to shake. Not from cold, though the May morning was still sharp enough to bite. Not from hunger, though her belly had forgotten what fullness felt like 3 winters ago. She shook, because everything she had been taught to believe for 12 years was rolling into her town on 18 wheels. And she had no idea whether she would survive the next hour. Behind her, in the apartment that had once housed 5 people and now held only 3, her daughter Annalisa was already awake, 7 years old, with bones that pressed against skin like tent poles against canvas, wearing a coat that had belonged to her dead brother. Sleeves rolled up 4 times, hem dragging on the floor. The child hadn't spoken in 6 days, not since the bread ran out. Through the window, Gerda watched the convoy slow, then stop, not at the Rathaus where the Nazi flag had hung until 8 days ago, not at the police station where the Gestapo office had been hastily emptied of files and photographs. The truck stopped in the Marktplatz, right in front of St. Nikolaus Kirche, where every Christmas for 38 years, Gerda had bought her children marzipan and roasted almonds from wooden stalls that no longer existed. In her right hand, hidden in her apron pocket, she clutched a knife, a small paring knife, dull from years of use, useless against rifles. But it was something, the last thing. When they came for Annalisa, because they would come, that much had been promised in every Wochenschau newsreel, every whispered warning, every hectograph-printed leaflet that had appeared in mailboxes during the final months. When they came, Gerda would at least try. She would at least have tried. The architecture of fear. To understand why Gerda Mannheim stood at her window with a knife in her pocket, why dozens of other German mothers in dozens of other Bavarian towns felt the same electric terror that morning, you must understand that fear is not born in a moment. It is constructed, brick by brick, lie by lie, over years. In 1933, when Adolf Hitler became chancellor, Germany was a nation of 80 million people who had lived through economic collapse, political chaos, and the humiliation of Versailles. The Nazi Party offered certainty, order, pride, and with those gifts came a world view, carefully crafted, relentlessly reinforced. By 1939, German children were learning in schools that Slavs were subhuman, that Jews were vermin, that the British were cynical imperialists, that the Americans, those mongrel descendants of criminals and slaves, were weak, decadent, incapable of sustained warfare. The propaganda ministry, under Joseph Goebbels, turned this worldview into art. Films like Jude Seuss, posters showing leering enemies, radio broadcasts that painted every defeat as a temporary setback, every retreat as a strategic repositioning. But, as the war turned, as Germany's cities became rubble and its armies became graveyards, the propaganda shifted. By 1944, as Allied forces advanced from both east and west, German civilians were being prepared for what would come after defeat. And what they were told was this: the enemy will show no mercy. Leaflets appeared in towns across Germany, distributed by local party officials, even as they prepared to flee. The text was always similar. The Americans will take revenge for every German bomb that fell on London. They will violate our women. They will steal our children. They will make slaves of those they do not kill. Better to die fighting than to live under their occupation. This was not empty rhetoric to people who had heard radio reports, true reports, of Soviet atrocities in East Prussia. When German refugees flooded westward in the winter of 1945, they brought stories that froze the blood. Villages burned, women raped, children shot. The Nazis pointed to these horrors and said, This is what awaits you. All of them are the same. Russian, British, American. They are all coming to destroy you. In the basement of Rosenheim's Volksschule, a yellowed poster still hung in early May. It showed an American soldier, grotesquely caricatured with exaggerated features and a bestial grin, reaching toward a terrified German child. The caption read, "This is the face of the enemy. Protect our children. Fight to the last breath." Gerda had seen that poster. Every mother in Rosenheim had seen it, and now the enemy was here. The square by 7 o'clock in the morning. The trucks had disgorged their contents into the Marktplatz. But not what anyone had expected. No soldiers with weapons drawn, no orders barked in harsh English, no roundups. Instead, wooden crates, dozens of them, stamped with English words and American stars. Soldiers, young men, most of them with faces that showed exhaustion deeper than a single night's missed sleep, began prying the crates open with crowbars. The sound of splitting wood echoed off the facades of buildings that still stood, a strange peacetime sound in a place where explosions had been the recent language. From his vantage point on the church steps, Father Hermann Keller watched with the same paralyzed uncertainty that gripped the rest of the town. He was 63 years old, had been the pastor of St. Nicolaus for 27 years, and had spent the last 12 of those years performing an exhausting dance, giving sermons that praised the German spirit, enough to avoid suspicion while carefully avoiding any mention of the party's more monstrous policies. His congregation had shrunk by half. Some had died in the war. Some had been taken away for reasons that were never officially explained. Some had simply stopped coming. Now, watching the Americans unpack their crates, Father Keller felt something unfamiliar, the vertigo of not knowing what story he was in. For 12 years, the story had been clear, even if terrible. Now the script had vanished, and no one had distributed the new one. The first child appeared at 7:15. His name was Otto Schreiber, 9 years old, wearing his father's Wehrmacht greatcoat, the hem cut away and sewn into a crude belt so it wouldn't drag. No shoes. Those had been traded for potatoes in February. His father was dead at Stalingrad. His mother was dying slowly in their apartment above the butcher shop, her lungs ruined by pleurisy and malnutrition. Otto should have been afraid. He had heard the same warnings as everyone else. But Otto was hungry, and the smell coming from those crates was unlike anything that had existed in Rosenheim for 18 months. He approached slowly, expecting, what? A rifle butt to the face, a shout, laughter at his presumption. Instead, an American soldier, Private First Class Daniel Morrison of Omaha, Nebraska, 22 years old, survivor of the Battle of the Bulge and holder of a Bronze Star he never talked about, looked down at Otto and did something extraordinary. He smiled. Not a predatory smile, not a mocking smile, a smile of recognition. The smile of someone who saw a hungry child and remembered what hungry children looked like because he had younger brothers and a mother who had scraped through the Depression by making soup from bones and vegetables she grew in their tiny backyard. Morrison reached into one of the open crates and pulled out a rectangular package wrapped in olive drab wax paper. He knelt, bringing himself to eye level with Otto, and held it out. "Chocolate," he said in heavily accented German. "Für dich." Otto stared at the package as if it might explode. He looked back over his shoulder toward the narrow street where his mother lay dying, then back at Morrison, then at the chocolate. He took it. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. Morrison steadied the package, showed him how to tear open the wrapper. The smell that emerged, sweet, rich, impossible, made Otto's eyes water. He broke off a corner, put it in his mouth, and started to cry. Not quiet tears, wrenching, gasping sobs that shook his skeletal frame. Because the chocolate was real, because it tasted like the Christmases he barely remembered, when his mother had saved enough money to buy marzipan, and his father had carved him a wooden horse that was lost now, burned for firewood last winter. Because the American soldier wasn't hitting him, wasn't shouting at him, was just kneeling there with infinite patience, waiting for Otto to finish crying. From the window above the butcher shop, Otto's mother watched. She had dragged herself out of bed, certain she would witness her son's arrest or execution. Instead, she watched an enemy soldier give her child food, watched her child taste sweetness for the first time in years, watched the collapse of everything she had been told to believe. She sat down on the floor and wept. The unraveling. By 8 o'clock, more children had appeared, cautiously at first, emerging from doorways and alley gates like starved cats, ready to bolt at the first sign of threat. But word was spreading through the town in whispers. They're giving away food, real food, to anyone who comes. Private Morrison and his companions, men from farms in Iowa, factories in Detroit, fishing boats in Massachusetts, continued unloading crates. C rations, K rations, tins of meat and vegetables, sacks of flour stamped with American eagles, cans of condensed milk, powdered eggs, coffee, sugar, salt. Things that had become semi-mythical in German civilian life, seen only in memories and propaganda films showing the abundance of the Reich, that had somehow never quite materialized on actual tables. An American lieutenant, Second Lieutenant James Fletcher, 24 years old, history teacher from Vermont, wounded twice and decorated once, stood on the flatbed of one of the trucks and addressed the growing crowd in carefully rehearsed German. "We are here to help you, to provide food and clean water, to help rebuild. We will not harm you. We will not take your children. We will not take revenge. The war is over. You are not our enemies anymore. You are people who need help, and we are here to give it." The crowd listened in silence, not trusting silence, not quite disbelieving silence. The confused silence of people who are waiting for the punchline, for the reveal, for the moment when the mask drops and the real truth emerges. But the moment didn't come. Instead, more crates, more food. American soldiers setting up trestle tables, beginning to organize distribution lines, speaking in broken German, asking if anyone spoke English, trying to communicate through gestures when words failed. And then, at 8:32 in the morning, Gerda Mannheim would remember the exact time, because she watched the clock on the Rat House Tower as it happened. Annalisa spoke. "Mama," her daughter said, her voice rusty from 6 days of silence. "Mama, I'm hungry." Gerda looked down at her child, at the hollow cheeks and the two bright eyes and the bones pressing through skin. She looked out the window at the square where German children were being handed rations by American soldiers. She felt the knife in her pocket. Useless now, absurd now. She took her daughter's hand. They walked to the square together, the kitchen that saved a town. By the third day, the temporary relief station in the Marktplatz had evolved into something more organized. The Americans had brought in more trucks, more supplies, more personnel. A medical officer, Captain Richard Walsh, 31, surgeon from Boston, veteran of field hospitals from Normandy to the Rhine, had set up a triage station in the church hall, where he examined malnourished children, treated infections, distributed the miracle of penicillin to people who had never heard the word before. But the real transformation happened at the edge of town, near the bridge over the Mangfall River. The bridge had been partially destroyed in the final weeks of the war, blown by retreating German forces to slow the American advance. Now American engineers were repairing it, not for military purposes. The war was over. They were repairing it so that supply trucks could reach the surrounding villages, so that food could flow to places even more isolated than Rosenheim. And beside the bridge, the Americans had set up a field kitchen. This was not symbolic. This was not propaganda. This was industrial-scale, humanitarian logistics. The U.S. Army had learned, through 3 years of combat in Europe, how to feed massive numbers of people in destroyed landscapes. They had mobile kitchens, water purification units, supply chains that stretched back across the Atlantic. And now, with the shooting stopped, they turned those capabilities toward a different mission. Every morning at 6 o'clock, 2 enormous field stoves, each capable of producing 200 gallons of soup at a time, were fired up. American cooks, supplemented by German volunteers who were stunned to be asked rather than ordered, began preparing meals. Soup made from U.S. Army beef and vegetables, bread baked in mobile ovens, coffee. Real coffee. Not the ersatz chicory mixture that Germans had been drinking for years. The distribution was methodical. Lists were compiled. Families were registered. But there was no column for party membership. No questions about who had worn which uniform or said which words. Lieutenant Fletcher, who had studied history and knew exactly what had happened in this country, had argued strenuously with his superiors about this. We check for war criminals, yes. SS officers, Gestapo, the leadership, yes. But starving families, starving children, we feed them, all of them. Because if we don't, if we make this political, we lose. We lose the peace, just like we won the war. His superiors, to their credit, agreed, so the kitchen operated without ideological tests. The only requirement was hunger, and hunger was universal. Gerda Mannheim came to the kitchen every day at noon. She stood in line, with women who had been her neighbors for 20 years. Women she had waved to at market, whose children had played with her children, who had all believed the same lies together, and were now unlearning them in the same communal silence. They didn't talk about the war. They didn't talk about what they had believed or what they believed now. They talked about recipes, about whether the soup today had more potatoes than yesterday, about how the Americans made coffee so strong it could wake the dead. Small talk, survival talk, the talk of people rebuilding reality, one sentence at a time. The man who learned to trust again. Among the German civilians who frequented the American kitchen was a man who had more reason than most to hate Americans. His name was Klaus Zimmermann, 34 years old, former Feldwebel, sergeant, in the Wehrmacht's 116th Panzer Division. He had been captured near Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Shot through the left shoulder during the chaotic retreat when German forces had collapsed under Patton's counterattack. Klaus remembered the moment of his capture with crystalline clarity. He had been lying in a snowy ditch, bleeding, certain he was going to die. The pain in his shoulder was extraordinary. The bullet had shattered his clavicle, torn through muscle, exited out his back. He could feel his heartbeat in the wound, each pulse sending fresh agony radiating down his arm and up into his jaw. He heard American voices, boots crunching through snow. He waited for the shot. It was what he would have done, what he had been taught to do. Wounded enemy combatants were a liability, a drain on resources. Better to finish them quickly. Instead, hands lifted him, carefully. American soldiers, whose faces he couldn't see clearly because his vision was graying out, carried him to an aid station. A medic cut away his uniform, exposed the wound, jabbed morphine into his thigh. The drug hit his system like warm water, dissolving the pain's sharp edges. And then, and this was the part that Klaus still couldn't quite process months later, an American surgeon operated on him. Immediately. No waiting. No triage that would put a German soldier at the bottom of the priority list. Within 2 hours of his capture, Klaus was on a surgical table, being treated for a wound that would have killed him by nightfall. The surgeon, Klaus never learned his name, reconstructed his shoulder, removed bone fragments, cleaned out the wound, stitched him back together with a care that seemed impossible, given the circumstances. When Klaus woke up in a POW hospital bed, his shoulder was immobilized. But he was alive. And he was stunned. In the Wehrmacht, Klaus had seen German military doctors performed triage dozens of times. German soldiers were treated first, obviously. Allied prisoners came later, if at all. Resources were limited. Priorities had to be established. This was rational. This was how war worked. But the Americans had treated him. An enemy soldier, a man who had been trying to kill them hours before, as if he were one of their own. They had wasted surgical time, medical supplies, drugs, bandages on keeping him alive. It made no tactical sense. It made no rational sense. Unless there was a different logic operating. A logic that said, this is a human being, and we save human beings, period. No calculations, no hierarchies. Just humanity recognizing itself across enemy lines. Klaus didn't believe it at first. He assumed there was an angle, a manipulation. The Americans wanted information, obviously. They would be kind until the interrogation started, and then the real face would emerge. But the interrogation never came. Or rather, it did come, but it was perfunctory. Name, rank, unit, no torture, no threats, no intimidation, just questions answered, recorded. And then he was sent to a POW camp where conditions were, again impossibly, decent. Food, clean water, medical care, Geneva Convention rules actually followed. By the time Klaus was released in April 1945 and made his way back to Rosenheim, his entire understanding of the war, of the enemy, of truth itself, had been upended. The Americans who had saved his life bore no resemblance whatsoever to the monsters described in German propaganda. They were just men. Tired men, scared men, men who wanted to go home, but men who had decided that even in war, even with enemies, certain lines would not be crossed. Now, standing in the food line at the American kitchen, Klaus watched the same dynamic play out on a civilian scale. He saw American soldiers distributing food without prejudice, without judgment, without the casual cruelty that had characterized so much of the Nazi regime's interactions with its own people, let alone with enemies. One afternoon in mid-May, Klaus approached Lieutenant Fletcher. In halting English learned from British POWs in the camp, he said, "I was soldier, Wehrmacht. You captured me at Bastogne. Your doctors saved my life. I want to say thank you. I want to say I am sorry. I want to say I don't understand, but I am grateful." Fletcher looked at him for a long moment, then said, in equally halting German, "You are welcome. The war is finished. We build now, not destroy." They shook hands. Klaus felt something break open in his chest, some tightly wound knot of shame and confusion and grief, and he turned away quickly before the American could see him cry. The mother's revolution. By June, Rosenheim had been transformed. Not completely, not magically. The bomb damage remained. The economic devastation remained. The trauma remained. But something fundamental had shifted. The shift happened in kitchens and living rooms, in whispered conversations between women who had lived through the same lies and were now comparing notes in the aftermath. It happened in the moment when Gerda Mannheim realized that Anneliese had laughed, actually laughed, a sound Gerda had not heard in over a year, while playing with a ball, given to her by an American soldier. It happened when Frau Schneider, whose husband had died at Kursk and whose son had died at Monte Cassino, watched American medics treat her daughter's infected leg wound and realized that hate was not universal, that nationality was not destiny. The propaganda had told them, Americans are monsters. Americans will destroy you. Americans represent everything evil in the world. But American soldiers had fed their children, had repaired their infrastructure, had treated their sick, had acted with a decency that threw into sharp relief the indecency of everything the Nazi regime had normalized. This created a cognitive crisis. The human brain resists contradictory information. When what you see conflicts with what you have been taught to believe, the mind performs gymnastics to preserve the old paradigm. Maybe these Americans are exceptions. Maybe this is a trick, a long game. Maybe the real cruelty will emerge later. But as days turned into weeks, the gymnastics became impossible to sustain. The evidence was overwhelming. The Americans were not monsters, which meant everything else might have been a lie, too. This was the revolution that happened in German mothers' minds in the summer of 1945. Not a political revolution, not an intellectual revelation, a revolution of trust, slowly and painfully rebuilt after years of systematic betrayal. They began to ask questions they had been afraid to ask before. If the Americans were not monsters, what about the Jews? If the Americans showed mercy, what did that say about the regime that had shown none? If enemy soldiers could act with humanity, what did that say about the inhumanity that had been committed in Germany's name? The answers to these questions were terrible. Most women did not pursue them fully. The psychological cost was too high. But the seed had been planted. The crack in the edifice had appeared. And through that crack, slowly, painfully, reality began to seep in. The accounting. By autumn, when the first truly cold nights returned and the American army had established permanent occupation infrastructure, the full scope of what had happened began to emerge. The Nuremberg trials started in November. Newsreels showed the evidence. Photographs from Dachau, from Bergen-Belsen, from Auschwitz. The skeletal figures in striped uniforms, the piles of bodies, the gas chambers, the crematoriums, the meticulous records of extermination. Rosenheim had no concentration camp, but it had had Jews. Gerda remembered the Goldstein family, who had owned the fabric shop on Münchener Strasse. They had disappeared in 1938. Gerda had told herself they had emigrated. Everyone had told themselves this. It was easier than knowing. Now watching the newsreels in the rat house where occupation authorities had set up a mandatory viewing program, Gerda knew where the Goldsteins had gone, knew what had happened to them, knew that she had known, somewhere, deep down, all along, and had chosen not to know because knowing was dangerous and not knowing was safe. This knowledge was unbearable. Many Germans rejected it outright. Allied propaganda, they said, exaggerations, isolated incidents. The mind protects itself. But Gerda remembered the American soldiers giving chocolate to Annalisa. Remembered Klaus Zimmermann's story about being saved by enemy surgeons. Remembered the field kitchen and the methodical, unglamorous work of feeding former enemies. And she thought, if they are capable of this much good, then we must have been capable of this much evil. It was not an abstract thought, it was visceral. It made her physically ill. She had been a good German. She had followed the rules. She had believed what she was told to believe. She had raised her children to be patriotic. She had mourned her husband, dead at Stalingrad, as a hero. She had convinced herself that the war was justified, that Germany had been encircled by enemies, that everything, the rationing, the bombing, the death, was necessary and noble, and it had all been for nothing. Worse than nothing. It had been for monstrous lies that had consumed millions of lives and left her country in ruins. The weight of this realization was almost fatal. Some Germans committed suicide in these months. Some went mad. Most simply went silent, retreating into private grief and private shame that would shape German culture for generations. But a few, and Gerda was among them, made a different choice. They chose to remember, to bear witness, to refuse the comfort of amnesia. Years later, in 1968, when her granddaughter asked her about the war, Gerda told her about the chocolate, about the American soldiers, about the moment when she realized everything she believed was wrong. "Why am I telling you this?" Gerda said to her granddaughter. "Because you need to know that good people can believe evil things, that propaganda works, that fear works, that when someone tells you who the enemy is, you must ask yourself, who benefits from my fear, who profits from my hate, and you must have the courage to trust your own eyes over their words." But how do you know what to trust? The granddaughter asked. Gerda thought about this. Look at how they treat the helpless, she finally said. Look at how they treat children, the sick, the defeated. That's how you know who they really are. Epilogue. The Weight of Mercy. Private First Class Daniel Morrison returned to Omaha in January 1946. He married his high school sweetheart, became a teacher, raised 4 children, and rarely spoke about the war. When he did speak about it, he talked about Rosenheim, about the German children with their haunted eyes and empty bellies, about how giving away chocolate bars had felt like the most important thing he had ever done, more important than medals or battles or any of the violence that had consumed 3 years of his life. I don't know if we won their hearts and minds, he told his son in 1973, when the parallels to Vietnam seemed inescapable. But we didn't lose their humanity. We didn't make them hate us more than they already did. And maybe that's the only victory that matters after the shooting stops. Klaus Zimmermann became a carpenter, rebuilt homes in Rosenheim, never joined a political party, voted in every election, and dedicated the rest of his life to the quiet, unglamorous work of making things instead of breaking them. He kept the X-ray of his reconstructed shoulder on the wall of his workshop, a reminder of the day an enemy had chosen to save him rather than let him die. Anneliese Mannheim grew up, became a doctor, specialized in pediatrics, and spent her career treating children with a particular gentleness that her colleagues noticed but never quite understood. She was driven by a memory she couldn't fully articulate, the memory of an American soldier kneeling in a town square, holding out a bar of chocolate, choosing kindness when cruelty had been expected. And Gerda Mannheim lived to be 89 years old. She died in 1989, the year the Berlin Wall fell, the year Germany began its final reunification. In her last months, when dementia had begun erasing most of her memories, she still remembered May 10th, 1945. Still remembered standing at the window with a knife in her pocket. Still remembered the moment when everything she believed shattered, and something new, painful, uncertain, but real, took its place. The trucks had rolled into town expecting enemies. They found human beings. And that simple recognition, repeated in hundreds of towns across Germany in the summer of 1945, changed the course of history more surely than any battle. Because mercy, in the end, is more powerful than vengeance. Because feeding a hungry child breaks more chains than any prison. Because when the shooting stops, someone has to decide what comes next. And the Americans, for all their flaws and contradictions, decided to build rather than to destroy. That is why German mothers cried when they looked at American trucks. Not from fear, though fear had brought them to the window, but from the terrible, overwhelming relief of discovering that the monsters were just men and the men were choosing to be kind.